welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOPLP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm delighted this morning to welcome Michele Bograd here. Michele is a PhD psychologist. She has more than 40 years' experience as a licensed therapist. She's been a nationally recognized presenter, author, and consultant on many topics, including gender and psychotherapy, domestic violence, and feminist family systems. And her newest chapter of adventure, growth, and service is being an end-of-life doula, which is what she's here, I'm happy to report, to talk to us about today. So first of all, welcome, Michele, and thank you so much for taking time to be with us on the morning show.
Thank you, Mary. I'm delighted to be here, eager for our conversation.
Oh, me too. Well, Michele, let's begin at the beginning. You know, people are accustomed to associating the word doula with birth. But at the other end of the life cycle, then, could you tell us what is the role of an end-of-life doula?
So an end-of-life doula is a new beginning field in the world of end-of-life care. And the doula world fits into a social movement, a cultural movement that's beginning to be more honoring of and aware of and the end of life as a major transition. That's going to become even more important in the future because as the baby boomers age, the amount of people over the age of 80 is going to be the largest in American history. So birth doulas, of course, are people that accompany people through labor and delivery, as well as the months preceding birth.
Yes.
In other words, they're there with practical care, with emotional care, not only around how to have a baby, but about the transformation of a person who's having a child or a couple or a family system. And the birth doulas realized that every single transition in Western life is marked. You know, going off to school, graduating from school, getting married, communions, sweet 16 parties if you come from Latin America. But around death, although there's transitions around the death itself, i.e. the funeral, people are not accompanied more fully around the major emotional, physical, community changes as someone's approaching death and dying. So the end-of-life doula movement came up in that context. And end-of-life doulas, Mary, are also called death doulas, transition specialists. There's lots of different language for it, in part because some people are frightened even by the term end-of-life doula. Right.
That makes sense. And, you know, well, of course, you know, I'd read about the statistic about the increasing number of people over 80 becoming a significant proportion of our population. And so, but I hadn't thought about it in terms of an increasing need and demand for people to develop rituals, ceremonies, company, counseling for people preparing for that. Because the older we get, the more we become aware that death awaits us all. So what you said makes perfect sense. And I'm curious to find out, Michele, because what you're saying is there's a growing need for this and an expansion of the number of people who will enter this field. But how did you find out about the existence of this role and what made you decide that you wanted to train to become a death doula?
I actually can't remember how I found out about it. I'm quite sure it was in the popular press or YouTube or Instagram as the word is getting out. The way I came to it in some ways was quite surprising to me, that I had hit my 70s, and so like many people, I'm aware my time is limited. People I know are getting sick or more frail. I mean, it's a sobering shift.
Yeah.
I found, at least.
I'm in my
70s.
70s too, and I totally identify with what you're
Right.
saying.
Right. It's a sobering shift. And I think on top of that, my dad had died by suicide when I was an adolescent.
Oh,
My mom died at almost 102,
wow.
7 years ago. But even with so I think I was accompanied by a sense of loss or death much of my life because of my father.
Yeah.
But even with my mom, where we had so much preparation, there were moments where I felt we don't have a map. We don't know
Yeah.
what's happening. And then kind of unexpectedly, I just woke up one day as I was thinking, I've been a therapist, as you said, for 40 years. I'm moving towards changing the nature of my practice, ultimately to end my practice. But I want to do something of service that feels very important to me. And all these things converge so that literally one day I was like, this is what I'm going to do.
Oh, that's interesting, Michelle.
And
So,
many people in the doula movement talk about like having a calling.
yeah.
It sounds dramatic, but I know it's possible. People come at it from very different roots, Mary, often because they've accompanied people in their families through death, or they've experienced traumatic deaths, or they've experienced the failure of even well-meaning friends and family to provide comfort and accompaniment. So people come to being doulas from all walks of life, all ages, all previous careers.
Well, that's really interesting. I can understand, with the impact of the different major losses that you've been describing, how it sounds like the inner pull, the dealing with grief and loss yourself, as well as the kind of more consistent contemplation of mortality that comes to all of us with aging. It sounds like it just crystallized then as an awareness that burst into your consciousness, and you realize, yeah, this is something that I want to do. I feel like this would be a calling for me. And I'm not surprised to hear that people from all different backgrounds come to it, because the experiences you're describing are universal to our humanity, Michelle. So it makes perfect sense to me that many people would come to it from different paths but wind up in the same place. So thank you for that description of your own personal experience. I appreciate it. I think, yeah, go ahead.
I also just want to clarify, Mary, that end-of-life doula's work, or thinking about death and dying, is not just in the province of people over 70.
Yeah.
For two reasons. One is that death visits us all.
At any age.
At any age.
Yeah.
And so the preparation for it, the contemplation of it, arguably is very important. But the other piece of it is the end-of-life work is not only about dying. It's not only focused on death itself. It's focused on how would our lives be different? What choices do we consider? What do we appreciate or cherish when we don't forget that we are mortal?
Right.
Right.
Right. Absolutely, Michelle. Yeah, absolutely. Well, Michelle, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is because I think, although I'm sure doulas for end of life will become better known, but almost everybody knows about hospice care. And could you talk a little bit about how the work of what you do as a doula is distinct from what people experience when they go for hospice?
Sure. So first, let me describe what hospice care is, because many people actually don't know what it is. And many people are afraid of hospice because they believe hospice means the end is totally imminent and that you're giving up on life. So hospice is a system that people can get primarily through Medicare, sometimes through private insurance, Early on, it was a kind of pioneering movement that was addressing the limitations of conventional Western approaches to death and dying, that looked at the patient as a patient rather than as a three-dimensional person.
Yeah.
So what hospice is, it's a service that's given to individuals and families when the patient is diagnosed. There's a prognosis of no more than 6 months of life to live. Then you are handed over to a team that has a doctor, a nurse, a chaplain, a social worker, a home health aide, who provides care often at home to the person who is dying. Now, because people don't die within 6 months often, hospice can be renewed. There's regulations for how to renew hospice. And so sometimes people can be on hospice for several years or more. And interestingly, there's been research that showed that at the very end of life, life is prolonged by a couple of months statistically when people go on to hospice and stop treatment.
Isn't that fascinating, Michele?
And that's because chemotherapy, interventions, surgeries, popping back and forth between emergencies and home, multiple hospitalizations, take a toll on the family and on the person themselves.
Yeah.
That's not how hospice is held publicly. As I said, people tend to be like, don't make me go on hospice. Many people, not everyone. What has happened with hospice, just very generally speaking, is as it became under Medicare, which legitimized it, which helped pay for it, which provided services to many more people, there are several things that happened. Hospice now is tightly regulated. Like when you go to see a doctor and they're doing 50-minute hours, I mean, they're doing 15-minute sessions. I was thinking as a therapist there with a 50-minute hour. You know, similarly, now under hospice, the number of patients that teams carry are and the kind of services you provide are more limited. So people have the belief that when you go on hospice, hospice is there all the time. But the majority of people in hospice die at home, and it's the families who are often shouldering the exhausting, confusing, frightening, sometimes precious, sometimes very important tasks of caregiving. So the doula world has come forth to fill some of the gaps that the medical establishment and hospice can no longer provide. So doulas are non-medical personnel. Even if the doula was previously a nurse, they cannot provide medical care. So we're non-medical people. Because the field is so new, doulas are not, there's not state boards, there's not licensing, there's not national certification. That gives doulas a lot of freedom to do many, many things. But it also means that people need to be very careful in vetting who they're getting, because people can take a weekend-long course and call themselves a doula and do doula work. Many of those people do very heartfelt, important work, but there's a wide range of what brings people to becoming a doula. So doulas do some of the things, or many, they overlap with many of the services of hospice. Doulas often do rituals, they do end-of-life planning, they don't do counseling, but they do support, they do respite care. In other words, they may come and sit with someone so a family member can go to the gym, go do errands. Doulas encompass a lot provide a lot, and then within that, Mary, many doulas specialize what they do.
Well, that sounds like a critically important role that doulas can play, and also an extremely variable role that doulas will wind up playing depending upon the situation of the individual person and the family. But it's really interesting what you describe about both, the benefits and the limitations of hospice. And I'm absolutely fascinated that when people stop many of the interventions with hospice, that people actually, it sounds like, the relief of the stress involved with the treatments and the appointments and everything actually enhances the lifespan or increases it by 2 months. That's a fascinating statistic. I was not aware of that. But there are certain things. Oh, go ahead, Michelle.
I'm sorry, Mary. It's not just the relief of the stress. It's also that treatment always comes at a cost.
Yes.
For example, the other day I heard of a friend who was towards the end of his life. He developed an intestinal block. They did surgery. There were complications to the surgery.
Yeah.
They did another surgery. Then he had to be put on a trach. There's a cascade of medical interventions that take a toll.
Yeah.
But there's another thing that's very important for families to consider, Mary. The effort to save someone at any cost, which is to be respected. I want to be clear, there's not one way to handle the end of life. But when a person or families are fighting until the very bitter end, what they cannot have is quiet, comfortable, peaceful time to reconcile to dying, to reconcile family dynamics, often very literally, to laugh, to have meals together, to have friends gather. In other words, making the decision to go onto hospice, to stop interventions, whether or not you're on hospice, isn't just a relief. It creates a context for a different kind of ending.
Yeah. And, that's extremely well put, Michelle. What it makes me think about is you create a space for people to continue living and having their life while they're preparing to die, which otherwise can get lost in a lot of medical procedures and all the activity and stress around that. So, and so the role of the doula then is to fill in some of what, for various reasons that you've been very eloquent about, hospice is no longer able or never was able to really provide for families. And into that space comes the doula. And you've talked some about already, you've given examples of some of the kinds of issues that doulas can deal with. But I was hoping, Michelle, you could give us some examples, maybe some stories, some narrative about some of the kinds of things that when people contact you about wanting your services, they're looking for help with.
So some people, Mary, and this may happen more and more as doulas are well known, contact end-of-life doulas before they've had any diagnosis.
Oh,
They may be people who are afraid of dying and don't want to go into therapy, don't have a community, i.e., like let's say a religious community that can hold them. They want to begin to talk about what it means to not forget about death.
Yeah.
Some people pre-diagnosis want to put things into place. They want to understand not only medical directives like a PULST or a MOLST or a will or a power of attorney, a healthcare proxy, but they really want to think about when I die, what do I want it to look like? Where do I want to be? Who do I want with me? Do I want music or not? Do I want to be touched or not? Do I want smells around me or not? For example, end-of-life care, there are now a range of ways to do body disposition. So some people, for example, I was contacted by a young person, no illness in sight, who is very ecologically minded. And they wanted to explore newer ways of body disposition, such as green burial, which doesn't use chemicals or concrete or embalming, or aquamation, which is now in some states taking the place of conventional fire cremation. So often people are wanting to plan ahead, or parents are wanting to make sure that everything's in place so that their grown children or their friends are not scrambling at the last minute.
Yeah.
I recently was contacted by someone who recently was diagnosed with a terminal illness. Now, they may not be close to dying, but they are getting this shock, and they're wanting to be accompanied from the diagnosis through their end of life. That might be a year or two away. So I'm not going to be seeing that person weekly. It's not like therapy, or it's more like getting your car tuned up is a little bit of a superficial comparison. But in other words, I'm going to be moving in and out of that person's life as they are moving through this process. And some of what doulas then do in this middle stage is people sometimes want to think through the decisions about, I have a daughter that I'm close to and a son I'm estranged from. How do I handle who's going to be my medical proxy? They want to think through decisions that if you go to a lawyer, for example, or online about end-of-life choices, you're not necessarily in an ongoing reflection on it. I've been contacted, another adult contacted me because they were kind of at a stalemate with a parent who didn't want to leave their house. And the adult child, wanted a conversation brokered about the parents' wishes. I've been contacted by people who are estranged from their families. As an example, like someone who's gay, lesbian, trans, and their family doesn't accept the partner or doesn't accept their community. And those people need to be very clear in their end-of-life wishes and have legal documents. Because without them, upon death, if they don't have those documents, the choices, for example, if they're unable to choose for themselves how their body is handled, the name actually that is used in obituaries, for example, for trans communities, those decisions without formal paperwork will devolve back to their family of origin, which often creates excruciating realities for that person's family of choice. Right? And then, Mary, I accompany people who are more in rapidly moving end-of-life scenarios. For example, working with someone who has ALS, who's progressing through the ALS process quickly, which doesn't always happen. And then lastly, I've been asked to accompany people in the very final stages of death and dying. That may mean going to a home or to a hospice house, sitting with the family, giving a family a map of what's likely to happen, teaching them what they're witnessing so that they're less afraid. Helping them to be with the person. As an example, Mary, I worked with a family where the person was dying, and the family was afraid, and everyone was kind of on their cell phones, with one person kind of tentatively by the bed. And I was able to help that family, not make them be a certain way, but speak to them about their fear. Do they want to move closer? Are there things they want to say towards the end? Do they want to touch the person? What did they want to do when the person died?
Yeah.
You know, people don't realize that if someone dies at home or in a hospital, they can ask for time. They can wait while family members gather. They can have a ritual. They can actually keep the person at home if they want, you know. So it's also educating people that even at the moment of death, you have many choices. And then there are doulas, Mary, who only sit vigil. For example, sometimes there's a person who is very isolated, or there's a family member who lives in another state and actually loves the person but does not want to remember them in the final hours. And they may hire doulas to sit vigil, you know, literally to be with the person through the final hours into death. So doulas can enter a relationship with a person at any point, and they provide a wide range of services.
Well, you know, it strikes me, Michele, listening to you with the kind of rich variety of services, comfort, support, and knowledge that you offer, that just as everybody's life is individual and very different, everybody's journey toward death, which is what we're all on, is extremely variable and different as well. But one thing that links the people that you're talking about is that they have overcome barriers to actually thinking about their own death and the death process. And yet we live in a culture that I think is often, the phrase death aversive is sometimes used, and many people find it not only, well, I think the base of it is too anxiety provoking to think about death, their own or family members, or that it's just morbid or impolite to talk about it. And I know I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about some of the historical basis or some of the cultural bases for, you know, those factors in our culture, the factors that have led us to be, I think it's fair to say, a fairly death-aversive culture, which would mean that people would not be able then to gain access to the critically important and extremely helpful services and knowledge base that you offer.
So let me maybe weave back and forth between cultural and historical. So first of all, I very much agree that we are a death-fearing culture. Or I would say that many North Americans are, because we have to remember that we are a very diverse country.
Yes.
For example, many Hindus or religions where there's many Buddhists who believe in reincarnation, people who come from other cultures where death is not a mystery, are not necessarily death aversive, even though they live in the States. So I'm going to be speaking in generalities.
Sure.
But I think we will talk later, Mary, because it needs to be woven in, not as a special topic, but as a given, to think about diversity and inequality when we're looking at death and how death is approached and how death can be experienced and supported. So arguably then, the American personality is a can-do, individual freedoms, success-oriented, persistent culture.
Yeah.
We believe the individual can make of their life what they want, can make of their death what they want. We're a very resourced culture. So that's important, because until the 1800s, early 1900s, death was not a mystery to Americans. People were dying young. They often died in the home. They were waked or taken care of in the home. The family took care of the funeral and the burial. People were buried in a field or in the backyard or in a location. During the Civil War, when a lot of the North were killed in the South, their families wanted their bodies brought up to the North. In order to do that, embalming was developed. It had never been used before then. This then began to change the nature of death because, in rituals around death, because people didn't need to be buried right away. They could actually be preserved and kept for a week or 2 weeks as family gathered. Out of that grew the funeral industry. And the funeral industry is now a very powerful lobby.
Yeah.
On the one hand, that provides massive protections so that bodies are not mistreated or sold or used disrespectfully. On the other hand, it's a major expense,
Yes.
a capitalized expense at the end of life.
Yeah.
And the funeral lobby is very powerful in the United States. And then coincidental with that, Mary, has been the development of the unbelievable technology that can keep people alive.
Yes. Yeah.
Some of that is powerful, life-prolonging, life-saving technology. Some of that is used to prolong life at any cost. And that's a value judgment, because I want to be clear.
Yeah.
So, for example, people can be on heart-lung machines. People can be kept alive when they're brain dead.
Yeah.
And there was, I can't remember what this man developed, but it may have been the person who developed something. He was Danish. I wish I could remember, Mary. I'm not going to be able to.
It's okay.
He developed a widespread. I think he was the developer of the ICU in Denmark, which now is in most hospitals. And later he came out saying, I developed the methodology, if it was the ICU, but let me use it as an example. I developed the methodology to keep people alive who would have a quality of life.
Yeah.
I did not develop this technology to keep people alive who would be on machines, who would lose their quality of life, even if they were alert, you know. So there's been a convergence of things where Americans are upset that people cannot be healed. They think there's ever more to do. There's another trial, there's another surgery, there's another effort. And all of that stands in the way. And that's been institutionalized in medicine, Mary.
Yeah.
So, for example, this isn't across the board, but often hospice is not brought up by a medical team until the very bitter end. The very bitter end. And until recently, doctors were not reimbursed for having longer conversations with patients about what's called goals of care. Excuse me, how people want to be treated.
Yeah.
So there's medical students are not required to take courses on death and dying.
Wow. Interesting.
They're required to take courses on birth.
Yeah.
They're required to be at a birth. They're not required to be at a death.
Interesting, Michelle. I did not realize that. It seems like a real gap.
So I would say that we are a culture, and you see this, Mary, in people that are pouring money into preserving bodies in the hopes that in the future they could be brought back to life and put into a younger body and live again. Live again.
The cryotechnology to freeze.
The cryotechnology.
Basically just your head, because they assume that there will be technology in the future that will provide you with a body or other parts. So, sorry to interrupt you, but it's a striking kind of movement.
And maybe an important movement. I mean, again, we have to be careful in this conversation because we don't know what's going to happen. There are people who will feel that is the greatest accomplishment of medicine, to allow us to live longer. And then there are those who will think we are interfering in the process of life and death, the process of degeneration and renewal, the process of really what is, arguably built into our cells, God-given,
Right.
if one uses, a more religious belief system. So, it's very complex, the conversation.
Well, it is complex, but what it underscores is how variable individual desires, wants, and needs are. And the benefit of the work that doulas do is that raising the awareness that if you have beliefs or values or wishes about your dying process and your death, it's good to give it some thought while you're still alive, and it's beneficial to be able to learn about the options, and certainly if one feels the call and the benefit of being able to talk it through with someone who will provide you with support, care, and knowledge, to consult with a doula, so you won't be at the mercy of a medical system that is driven really towards seeing, I think people say doctors see death as a failure, rather than death comes with birth. It's the end point. Right. It's a natural process. So that's really fascinating, Michele. Thank you so much for that brilliantly concise sketch of cultural and historical kind of influences on some of the ways many Americans wind up viewing death and the results of some of those attitudes. I know, Michele, that we've all heard the expression a good death. And you wrote and thankfully gave me a copy of a very thoughtful article that you wrote called "Is the Good Death a Good Idea?" And in that article, you point out that whether we all at some point reflect upon death and carry ideas about how we hope to die based upon expectations or belief about what a good death could or should be, as an end-of-life doula, you see the value of both defining what a good death is, but also the ways in which it can sometimes be problematic. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about that fascinating question of what's the benefit and how can it sometimes be problematic?
So I think when people are asked about death and dying, or think about the death and dying of people they love, one of the first things they'll say is, "I want a good death."
Yeah.
And one of the things we need to keep in mind, Mary, is the idea of a good death is culturally created. It's not a given in nature. So, for example, 100 years ago, when religion was a more pervasive part of culture than it is for some people, let me put it that way, because clearly it's pervasive in many ways. But a good death meant reconciling with God.
Yeah.
A good death meant cleansing your soul. A good death meant atoning for your sins. So now, in Western culture, a good death tends to be defined by two major elements: comfort and free choice. Within that, I want to point out, is our glorification of the individual. I can have the death I want, and I want the death that I want. And I support that to a big degree. So, for example, people may want to have all life supports, all efforts made to sustain life, even if they're no longer conscious. On the other end of the continuum are people who know they have a terminal illness within 6 months, with a 6 months prognosis, who within the states where this is legal, which is not in Massachusetts, although the majority of people support this, is medical aid in dying.
Yeah.
where people are given medications legally after a careful vetting process, and they choose the day of their death.
Yeah.
So the good death for many people is being out of pain, having pain medication, being with their loved ones, being lucid as long as possible, having time to say goodbye, having a bucket list that they may fulfill, but mostly being comfortable and in a locale of choice with the interventions that they want to have, surrounded by the people that they'll be most comforted by. That idea, that ideal is important. Many people are able to have that with planning,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
With conversations with medical providers, pastoral counselors, communities, friends, and family. On the other hand, there are a number of things, a number of ways that the good death is an idea that I think torments people. One is that whatever death we have, almost always for the people that are left behind are profound regrets. They may be major, they may be minor, but they're tormenting regrets. And people will say, she could have had, they could have had, he could have had a better death. If only I, if only the medical team, if only.
Yeah.
And so the idea of the good death is often this unapproachable ideal that leave people with profound regrets about what was or wasn't done around a loved one's ending.
Yeah.
Another reason the good death is a complicated idea, Mary, is the good death that I just described. I have choice. I have access to a medical system. I have the power to negotiate what I want. I have people who will help me do this. That is a choice of privilege.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
That is a choice often of people who have resources, belong to dominant, socially acceptable classes, races, and ethnicities, are comfortable and protected within medical systems, believe that I can go toe-to-toe with my doctor about what I'm wanting.
Yeah.
That is often not the case. For example, people of color have often experienced profoundly prejudicial treatment within mainstream medical systems. So they're distrustful of the system.
Yeah.
They're often under-medicated or over-medicated. The medical world is often suspicious. For example, I've heard accounts of Black people who are in pain, people of color who are in pain, and the medical world is saying, we're not going to honor your need for more pain medication because we think it's driven by addiction. Another example, Mary, is I have a friend who's an African-American doula, and she has had multiple experiences of Black families being in hospitals, and they're crying or wailing as a family member has died, and security is called.
Oh my. Oh, Michelle.
It's not an uncommon experience.
Oh my gosh.
During the AIDS epidemic, people often had to go back into the closet in order to get equitable care. So for many people, Mary, the good death that we take for granted is not accessible. The majority of people who use hospice are white and educated. Many people don't know about the services or are suspicious of them or are not treated well within those systems.
Yeah.
And then, Mary, there is another reason why, excuse me, I think the idea of the good death needs to be questioned, which is simply death is not always good.
True. Yeah.
There are people who witness loved ones who are terrified of dying,
Yeah.
who are in, like bone cancer, for example, is infamous for being extremely hard to treat, to relieve people from. So that you can have people who are raging against death, you know, Dylan Thomas,
Yeah.
rage against the dying of the
Right.
light.
Yeah.
What people witness in death, death is not pretty.
Yeah.
You know, there's been a movement within the death positivity efforts to have TV shows and movies show death realistically, because research has shown that the use of CPR or what death looks like, most people learn from the media. And the media has this very sanitized, you know, I look at you, Mary, my loved one, I'm a moment from death. I look at you and I go, I love you. I smile, I reach for someone, and I quietly pass away.
Yeah.
That is not what death looks like.
Yeah.
And often there's suffering.
Yeah.
So, for example, the American Buddhist nun and hospice advocate, Roshi Joan Halifax, another Buddhist teacher, Frank Ostaseski, who wrote a book called 5 Wishes, I believe. They are helping people, as well as death workers, work on how can I be present for the death that I'm witnessing.
Yeah.
How can I be present for my death that I will not be able to control?
Yeah.
So that when I am with the person who's dying or facing my own death and dying, I don't have an idea of the good death
Yeah.
that is creating a contrast that takes me away from the transformative and often sacred moment of transitioning from life to death.
Yeah, for just the authenticity of how death will unfold. There are some things we can have choices over, but ultimately, one could put it that death is in charge. It will happen to us when it happens to us. We can plan, and it's good to have a plan, because sometimes, as you've been saying throughout this interview, you know, you can have choices that you can make about how it unfolds. But best to be prepared for the authentic reality of what death can look like. And as you say, it's often accompanied by suffering, and it's not pretty. And we'll miss out on an important learning experience. If we're not prepared to be present with what is actually happening, we'll be somewhere else in our own minds. And we'll be missing something important and transformative. And also, as you raise the possibility, then there can be, for family members of those left behind, flooded with regret, so they're the opposite of being at peace with
right.
death and dying.
And Mary, let me add 2 other pieces. One is that because we can't control all that's happening, we're often facing very hard choices.
Yeah.
An example is how people navigate pain and consciousness. So, for example, certain cancers are well known, certain disease processes are well known for being very painful at the end of life. There is a state called terminal agitation which is when people towards the end of life get very agitated. Sometimes getting out of bed, sometimes calling out, sometimes being extremely anxious. The question then becomes, should we medicate the pain? And the dilemma with most pain medications is they often lead people to be less conscious.
Yes.
So then the family members and the person themselves are trying to weigh, do I want consciousness or do I want to be out of pain?
Yeah.
The dilemma there is often what the family members want is different from what the person wants.
Yeah, I imagine the family members often want the cessation of pain because it's so hard to watch.
They often want the cessation of pain, but sometimes they want the person conscious as long as possible.
Right. Okay.
But the person wants the cessation of pain. And then additionally, Mary, sometimes medication is given where the families are fearful that the medication is hastening death or even has caused death, when actually there was an underlying process of dying that was occurring coincidental with the medication.
Yeah.
So again, where doulas can be helpful, as can nurses, doctors, hospice personnel, is helping family members with very complicated decisions.
Yeah.
And to be understanding that there is an underlying natural process that looks a certain way, sounds a certain way, can smell a certain way, and they can accompany their loved ones through that process with less fear.
Yeah. Well, which is a huge gift that a doula can make, because if you're afraid, it's hard to be authentically present with what's happening. None of us are very good at that. So if you can help people know what to expect and make those decisions ahead of time, then everyone can be more accepting of the natural process that we're all going to go through at some point. Michele, thank you so much. It's been so enlightening to talk to you. You've clearly, you talk about these issues in such a thoughtful and sensitive way. I've just thoroughly enjoyed our conversation about this, and I've learned a lot. So thank you so much for taking the time to educate us about what doulas do and about death and dying and so many other things. One final question before we finish for today, Michele. If people want to learn more about end-of-life doulas, what resources can they consult?
So I do want to say just one more piece, and then I'll be glad to wrap up.
Sure.
The piece that I want to say is I have a belief, because obviously one of the things we did not have time for today, Mary, is talking about complex family dynamics around death and dying. What I want to reiterate is the conversations about death and dying are conversations about living.
Yes. Yeah.
There are conversations among family members about who are we to each other, how can we love and support each other, how can we repair relationships, how can we turn to what we all are going to face together.
Yeah.
So I really invite people to begin to consider what inhibits them from bringing death into their own life, which in my experience, it's not easy. I don't want to, again, idealize it or simplify it. It makes every moment more precious.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is a reminder of what is most important. And so I just invite all your viewers and listeners to consider turning towards some of those conversations in their own pace, in their own way, and repetitively over time. It's not a single conversation.
Yeah.
Where people can learn more about becoming a doula, I would, in my self-interest, I would send them to my website. I have a lot of resources there. That's www.michelebograd.com, MICHELEBOGRAD.com. I would send them to INELDA, INELDA, which is a national training organization, as well as to NEDA, the National End-of-Life Doula Association. These are easily, I have them on my website. They can be also found by Googling. You can simply Google end-of-life doulas, and you'll get a lot of articles, a lot of YouTube videos. So yes, I would definitely send people out to gather information. And I very much appreciate, Mary, the opportunity to speak to you and to be there for your viewers and listeners.
Well, I cherish being able to talk to you about this, Michele, and maybe you'll just have to come back and talk more about those complex family issues, because I think every family has them pretty much. Michele, I can't thank you enough. It's been just wonderful to talk to you. I really appreciate it. So thank you.
Mary.
That's it for today, everybody. Please join us again next Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, everybody, be well.